do I think Genesis 1 to 3 actually happened or not? And I think this is a really useful question because my answer should set a frame for how I think about the Bible, which will be helpful with the other questions, but also with the Bible in a year. And I think this question is actually an unhelpful question. I think we spend a lot of time trying to understand the historical events that happen behind the passages we read in the Bible. And I think that misses the point. I think a better question is, why has the writer, the author, structured the story, written the story, included bits that they have? And so to give you an example, my wife and I have been married now for 18 months. And so when someone asks, how do you guys meet? How did you get married? We've got a fairly consistent pattern that we rely on. And that changes depending on the context. For example, if it's someone who I feel comfortable with, I might give them some of the juicier stories about how we got together. For example, the very first conversation that we had was for Grace's undergraduate dissertation, which was, what do Christians think about sex before marriage? And I like to tell people that was actually, that interview for her dissertation was actually her vetting me before we started dating. So that would be a story that I included if I felt comfortable enough with the person. If not, I might miss that story out, as well as some others. Also, depending on how much time we have. So if we've got half an hour, they've come over for coffee or they've come over for food, I can go through all of the different beats, all of the different events and moments that happened in our relationship. Whereas if it's on a Sunday after church and I've only got 5 minutes, I might condense it. And so I might take 2 separate moments and merge them together to make the story still make sense. Or I might rearrange things as I cut things out. Oh, that doesn't make sense. So I'll put them in a slightly different order. Now, say someone's listening to me share this story with someone else and they've heard a different version of the story. They're not going to interrupt and go, excuse me, you said that this happened first. And actually, that didn't happen there. That happened when you were doing this. They're not going to say that because there's an understanding that that's kind of not the point of this conversation. The point is to give you a sense of a general gist of how we got together and a little bit of who we are as people and how we work as a couple. And so I approach the Bible in a similar way, that I focus on what did the writer include. They could have mentioned lots of things. They specifically mentioned these stories. They specifically put these stories in a set order and describe these stories in a particular way. So what is it that they are trying to communicate? And a great example of this is the Gospels, because in the Gospels we have 4 different versions of the life of Jesus, and each author is trying to communicate something slightly different. So, for example, let's take the event of Jesus going into the temple and overturning the tables. In the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this event happens at the end of Jesus' ministry. Yet in John's Gospel, this event happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And people that are really kind of obsessed with very literal, very kind of trying to find the historical events behind these stories come to the conclusion, well, it must have happened twice, that both at the start of Jesus' ministry and at the end of his ministry, he goes into the temple and he throws up the tables. And that completely misses the point that actually the writers are trying to do something slightly different with their gospel. So, for example, the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their whole gospels are working their way towards Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where Jesus entered on a donkey. It's where the Last Supper was. It's where his arrest and then execution was. And it's where his resurrection was. And so everything is moving towards that. And as this was an event that happened in Jerusalem, they put it at the end of Jesus' ministry. For John, that's something he's not particularly interested in. He's more interested in showing you that Jesus' ministry is upturning the old way of doing things. And so throughout John's gospel, Jesus is regularly at butterheads with the religious leaders of the time, the Jewish leaders. And so he puts this event right at the beginning of his gospel because he wants to set the tone for Jesus' ministry. That just like this story, the rest of Jesus' ministry is going to have him at headalogues with the rest of the religious leadership and the time, and he's going to be flipping things on their head. And so let's bring this back to Genesis 1 to 3. Do I think it actually happened? I think it's just the wrong question. We need to be asking, why has the author laid out the story like this? Because this is how he wants you to think about creation. And so in some ways, it doesn't really matter the historical events behind it. What's more important is, why does he want you to think about creation in this way? And how does thinking about creation in this way shape our thinking in other areas? So that's a useful question. And I want to be clear, this isn't me saying that therefore none of it is real, all of it is fake, it's all just made up stories that have a moral meaning. I'm not saying that. If you go back to the example of the stories of me and my wife getting kind of dating and getting married, those events happened. I might change the details a little bit, I might shuffle things up, but the general beats, we did meet, we did date, we did get married, those actually happened. And so in the same way, I believe in the Bible. I am a firm believer in the authority of the Bible and the infallibility of the Bible. But I'm less focused on the specific details of exactly what happened behind the passages we read, and more about what is going on, what is the writer trying to communicate to us. So some of you may find that as a bit of a non-answer, some may find you helpful, some might be like, this is bordering on heresy, at which point you've gathered some really useful information because you've probably learned I'm not the YouTube channel for you, and that's great. That's really useful information to have, and there's no problems there. But that's my understanding of Genesis 1 to 3. I hope you found that helpful. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments below. This was a snippet of a much larger conversation, which you can find here, or you can get plugged in with our Bible in a Year commentary just there. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next video.